When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But the silence was heavy, carrying the weight of millions of lives lost. Across Europe, the landscape had changed forever. Entire cities lay in ruins. Farmland was scarred with trenches, and entire regions were left unrecognizable. The war had devoured empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once vast and diverse, collapsed into smaller states that struggled to stand on their own. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled for centuries, was dismantled, its lands divided between Britain and France. Russia, consumed by revolution during the war, saw the fall of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks, who created a new communist state. Germany, once confident of victory, faced defeat and humiliation. The Kaiser fled, leaving a fragile republic in his place. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles sealed Germany's fate with crushing reparations and territorial losses. The treaty was meant to secure peace, but instead it created anger and bitterness among the German people. Many Germans believed they had been betrayed, and they called it the stab-in-the-back myth. This myth would later be used by extremists to rise to power, feeding hatred and division. Beyond politics, the human cost of the war was staggering. Over 16 million people had died, and millions more were wounded. Entire families were broken, with fathers, sons, and brothers never returning home. Those who survived often carried physical scars and deep psychological wounds. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, haunted countless veterans who struggled to adjust to life after the trenches. Cemeteries stretched across Europe, endless rows of white crosses marking the dead. A generation came to be known as the Lost Generation, scarred by trauma and disillusionment. Writers and poets captured this despair, describing the mud, fear, and futility of the trenches. The old idea of war as noble and glorious was shattered forever. Economically, Europe was devastated. Farmlands were ruined, factories destroyed, and nations drowned in debt. The United States, in contrast, emerged stronger, its industries thriving while Europe struggled to rebuild. The map of Europe was redrawn as new countries appeared. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were born. While these new nations symbolized hope, their borders were drawn hastily, creating future conflicts. In the Middle East, Britain and France divided Ottoman lands without regard for the people living there. This sowed tensions that continue to shape conflicts even today. Colonial empires also shifted, with Britain and France gaining territory but losing much of their strength. The war had shown that European powers were not invincible, sparking independence movements in Asia and Africa. In India, leaders like Gandhi gained momentum, inspired by the sacrifices of Indian soldiers who fought in the war. In China, anger at being ignored in post-war treaties fueled resentment that would later explode. The United States emerged as a world power, celebrated for its role in ending the war. American soldiers returned home as heroes, and the US economy boomed during the 1920s. But America also turned inward, refusing to join the League of Nations. The League of Nations, created to keep peace, was weak from the start without US support. It lacked power to enforce decisions, and its failures would become clear in the years ahead. Meanwhile, advances in technology were another legacy of the war. The conflict had accelerated weapons development, introducing tanks, machine guns, and poison gas. These innovations made warfare deadlier than ever before, changing battles forever. Medical advances also grew, with new techniques for surgery and treating wounds. But even these improvements were overshadowed by the sheer horror of industrial war. Civilians had suffered deeply too. Cities were bombed, blockades caused hunger, and diseases spread rapidly. The Spanish flu of 1918, worsened by wartime conditions, killed more people than the war itself. Women had taken on new roles during the war, working in factories, offices, and hospitals. When the war ended, many refused to return quietly to old restrictions. Their efforts helped speed up the fight for women's rights across the world. In Britain, women over 30 won the right to vote in 1918. In the United States, women secured suffrage in 1920, reshaping democracy. Social life changed too, as people sought to escape the trauma through music, dance, and culture. The Roaring Twenties became a time of both energy and disillusionment. Art movements like Dada and Surrealism grew from the chaos, rejecting old traditions. Writers questioned authority, while jazz and cinema spread a new culture of expression. But beneath the surface, bitterness lingered. Germany's humiliation and economic collapse fueled anger that extremists would later exploit. Hyperinflation in the 1920s left Germans carrying wheelbarrows of worthless money. The seeds of the Second World War were already being planted. Historians often say World War II was born directly from the consequences of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, instead of securing peace, created conditions for another global conflict. Yet the war also left important lessons for humanity. It showed the dangers of unchecked nationalism, militarism, and alliances built on suspicion. It revealed how peace built on punishment could never last. The war also sparked advances in diplomacy, as nations searched desperately for new ways to prevent future wars. But the failure of those efforts was clear in the 1930s, when the world slid once again toward conflict. For ordinary people, though, the memory of the First World War was deeply personal. It was in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the names carved into village memorials. It was in the stories whispered by veterans who could never truly describe what they had seen. For many, the war was not history. It was a wound that never healed. Across Europe, monuments and memorials rose to honor the fallen. Every town, large or small, carried reminders of the lives lost. National holidays were created, days of silence to remember the dead. The poppy became a symbol of remembrance, blooming red in fields once soaked with blood. Generations grew up in the shadow of the Great War, shaped by its scars. Children of the 1920s and 1930s heard their parents speak of suffering, fear, and sacrifice. That memory influenced politics, art, and culture for decades. The war to end all wars had not ended war. It had changed it. The 19th century world of empires and monarchs was gone forever. The 20th century, with its new powers, revolutions, and ideologies, was born from the ashes. World War I transformed societies, redrew borders, and redefined power. It unleashed forces that could not be contained, reshaping the world in ways no one expected. And though it ended in 1918, its consequences echoed far into the century. From revolutions and independence movements to economic crises and political extremism, its shadow was long. Even today, we still live with the legacies of that conflict. The Middle East's instability, the memory of global war, and the push for international cooperation all trace back to 1914, 1918. The First World War was not just a battle of armies, but a turning point for humanity. It was a warning about the cost of pride, rivalry, and unchecked ambition. It was a tragedy that scarred millions and reshaped nations, and its consequences remind us that peace is fragile and war changes everything. When the war ended, people hoped it was truly the last, but history had other plans, and the world would soon face an even greater storm. Yet the memory of World War I continues to shape us, a reminder etched into history. A century later, its lessons remain as urgent as ever. The war ended, but its consequences never truly disappeared. They live on in the world we inherited, and in the stories we continue to tell. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment for the next parts.